I have always believed in God. I was raised in a Jewish household, and while I have always held a belief in God, I have never experienced the deep emotional sense of connection to Him in the way that some people describe. That's not to say that I have never felt any kind of emotional connection with my heritage and culture, especially through things like prayer. For example, I've participated in tefillot, in prayers at the Kotel, the Western Wall, thousands of Jews praying together at Slichot, for example, around the high holidays, when thousands of Jews are there gathered, praying together. This sense of unity and tradition in these moments is incredibly profound. But it differs from what some people describe as a personal spiritual connection with God. In terms of spiritual encounters, I've had experiences that some might call spiritual. However, I've always viewed these through a very different lens. To me, they have been random coincidences, though at the time I may have attached more meaning to them than was necessary. I am aware that other people in similar situations might have perceived these moments as divine encounters, but for me, they never held any kind of spiritual divine weight or led to any kind of belief in anything supernatural in those moments. So while I've always believed in God, I have never experienced the kind of emotional faith-based connection that many people speak of when they talk about their faith. No tangible sense of His presence directly felt in my life, no spiritual epiphanies. Now, moving this over to Christianity, when people talk about discovering Christianity or coming to faith, many recount moving experiences. Moments where they felt emotionally stirred by the Spirit, where their hearts were opened, or where they had some kind of encounter with Jesus directly that led them to believe. Now, this is especially common among Protestant evangelicals, Messianic Jews, where personal testimony often plays a very key role in the faith journey. Now, with Catholics and Orthodox, depending on where, this may not be emphasized as much to the same degree, but even there, many believers do recount feelings of being moved by the Spirit or experiencing some kind of divine connection or even visions of Mary, things like that. For me, however, I have never had that kind of emotional experience of divine intervention or an encounter with Jesus or anything like that. What I'm describing here may seem to some like I'm saying I've never felt the feeling of faith, the kind of heart-stirring, spirit-moving moment that others describe. But I want to make it clear that despite the absence of such emotional experiences in my life, my belief in God has always been steadfast. That being said, I am here today to give a full defense of Christianity from my perspective. Now, why would I do this? Why would I argue for Christianity when I never had a dramatic conversion moment or any kind of emotional experience of faith? The reason is simple. Despite not feeling an emotional connection to Christianity, through intellectual study and pursuit of truth, I have come to the conclusion that Christianity is either true, or at the very least, the closest thing to truth that one could find. And for that reason, I am defending it today, not based on any kind of personal testimony, but based on the intellectual decision that Christianity must be true, or at the very, very least, should be considered true for the betterment of society. Now, let's begin this with a very brief discussion on why believe in God at all, and not atheism. Now, I won't dive deeply into this. Countless scholars have already made these arguments. However, I want to briefly address it as it serves as the foundation for why Christianity. There are many classical arguments for the existence of God, the moral argument, fine-tuning argument, and so on. But today, I want to focus on the transcendental argument, not because it is in any way the best argument or the only argument, because it is a critical argument for laying the framework and foundation for why specifically Christianity once you have come to belief in God. So, at the core, most atheist responses to the existence of God are a form of intellectual shrug. There's no real grounding or foundation for their disbelief. It's either a dismissal due to some perceived lack of evidence, or simply not wanting to believe. Some atheists are brilliant and offer well thought out arguments, while others reject belief for less thoughtful reasons. However, many religious people believe that atheism is self-refuting. If we are simply chemical processes, if our thoughts are merely the result of brain chemistry, we have no way of validating the accuracy of our perceptions. Our understanding of logic, ethics, and reality could be completely distorted by these processes, leaving us unable to trust our own worldview. To truly understand logic, ethics, metaphysics, knowledge itself, we need a grounding in something transcendent, something beyond matter, a self-existent divine being. Otherwise, we cannot actually claim to know anything with certainty because our perceptions could be flawed at their very chemical core. In short, to make sense of reality, to know anything with certainty, we must appeal to a transcendent being who provides a foundation for objective truth. Without this, we have no way to ensure that our understanding of the world is accurate or trustworthy. In short, this is the transcendental argument for God, very superficial level of it. But why is it important in this discussion? Because the transcendental argument for God also lays the groundwork for what we should expect from the one true God. If the God or religion we're assessing cannot ground our metaphysics, our epistemology, or ethics in an objective way, if it does not offer a framework for people everywhere to live in accordance with the objective standard of knowledge and ethics, then that God cannot be the one true God. This is why the transcendental argument is so crucial to this discussion. It provides the foundation for assessing what kind of God would be worthy of our belief, setting the stage for how we'll evaluate the rest of the conversation. From this starting point, we can explore why someone would believe in Christianity over other religions. Again, I'm not doing a complete debunk of this religion versus Christianity and so on. That's been done 1,000-fold, and I'm not going to do that here. I'm just giving the very basics without delving into the depth at all. So let's look at why Christianity over other religions. So let's start with Islam, for example. Why not Islam? Well, there are a few reasons, but I'll focus on a few key points relevant to this discussion. First, Islam is has self-refuting ideas when compared to Christianity and Judaism. In its purest form, directly from the Quran, Islam would allow Christians to follow Jesus and Jews to follow the Torah, claiming they're still living in accordance with God's will. However, this contradicts the essence of Islam itself, as it rejects the divinity of Jesus or the authority of the Torah. There are other internal contradictions and issues such as lack of mass revelation, which is seen in both Judaism and Christianity, and this further challenges Islam's claim. Additionally, the character of God in the Quran is inconsistent with the God of the Bible, particularly in terms of justice. This inconsistency would disqualify Islam from being the true faith in light of the transcendental argument. Now, turning to Judaism. Why wouldn't Judaism be the genuine approach to understanding God? Well, the first issue lies in the historical development of rabbinical Judaism. As we know, rabbinic authority, which became central after the destruction of the Second Temple in the 1st century, is fraught with contradictions. The rabbis' claim to authority are often self-refuting or at best circular in how they justify their power. There are clear historical manipulations and distortions of the original Jewish authority to centralize control under rabbinical leadership, which complicates the legitimacy of their claims to divine truth. But let's set aside the historical issues for a moment and consider the hypothetical scenario where rabbis could be right about their interpretation of God's will. Well, even then, Judaism faces a fundamental issue. It is an ethnocentric religion. Now, while it's true that conversion to Judaism is possible, it is highly controlled, often discouraged, particularly in more traditional circles. There is a separation between religious and non-religious Jews, reinforcing the notion that Judaism is a national identity as much as a religion. And again, while there are converts allowed, it is specific the nation of the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, including those converts, that have that relationship with the divine. This is a problem when we consider the idea of a universal connection to God. Judaism does not offer a framework that applies universally to all people, but rather one that is largely confined to the Jews, with different sets of rules and expectations for Gentiles. Rules for me and not for thee. Oh, no. This means it cannot provide a universal ethical system or a objective epistemology that grounds knowledge for all humanity in a divine context, which directly contradicts the requirements we established with the prior argument. So simply put, Judaism's focus on ethnic identity and its lack of universal framework for all people to connect with God the same way disqualifies it from being the true approach to understanding the divine. We'll touch on other aspects of this debate later, because specifically with Judaism and Christianity, there's an additional debate there. But for now, the lack of a universally accepted and applicable framework is a major concern here. So let's move on to Eastern religions very briefly, like Hinduism. Why not Hinduism? Or some kind of spiritualist conception of God. Again, we run into the issue of the lack of mass revelation. There is no objective, revealed divine will to give humanity in a way that applies universally. Hinduism, for example, is a collection of different paths with many gods, spiritual ideas that are highly individualized. This makes it impossible to ground universal objective standard of truth, ethics, and knowledge in Hinduism. At this point, I also want to bring up the ideas of Alan Watts as far as relates to Hinduism and other Eastern religions, which he popularized in the West. He often began his teachings with the rhetorical question of, what would you do if you were God? As he began to describe what God is like and what God would do. This approach is fundamentally absurd because it assumes that human logic can grasp the vastness and transcendence of God. If we base our understanding of God on human logic and perception, we're bound to encounter contradictions and misunderstandings. This makes Eastern religions, including Hinduism, ill-equipped to meet the criteria we've set for what the one true God should be. And moving on to the question of paganism or nature worship, I once encountered a comment on one of my videos, someone trying to debunk Christianity or religion in general, saying, well, I believe in Harry Potter. I'm challenging you to debunk that. My response was simple. The Harry Potter books are categorized as fiction by the author. There's no claim to truth in them. Similarly, most pagan myths are clearly described as myths with no inherent claim to truth. They are fictional stories that do not provide a coherent framework for understanding a transcendent God. Moreover, pagan religions lack the attributes we've established as necessary for justifying belief in the one true God. Without these key features, paganism and similar nature-based religions fail to meet the criteria we've laid out for what we should expect from a divine being capable of grounding our objective morality, knowledge, and truth. So that brings us to Christianity. And while there are certainly other religions and other religious ideas, for the purpose of this discussion, Christianity stands out as the only belief system that meets the criteria we've established. Christianity provides a foundational framework that is universal to all people. It can ground our knowledge of the world, our understanding of how the world works, and our beliefs about God. The beauty of Christianity also lies in the fact that it applies to everyone equally. Anyone can, and according to Christianity, should become Christian. There's no ethnic or national barrier like in Judaism. As it says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, meaning that there is not a limit of ethnicity, nationality, or culture, and it does not rely on other religions in a way that is self-contradictory. Now, Jewish polemicists often argue that Christianity depends on Judaism, but not the other way around. What they mean to say is that the New Testament relies on the Old Testament as the prophecies in the Old Testament find their fulfillment in Jesus. However, even that argument is severely flawed, because if you were to strip away the New Testament of all references to the Old Testament prophecies, you would still have the account of a man named Jesus who came, performed miracles, died, and was resurrected, events that stand on their own merit. We'll discuss this more later, but technically speaking, Christianity does not require Judaism to exist. Ironically, it is actually Judaism that depends on Christianity, and even to an extent Islam. One of the foundational claims of Judaism is the revelation at Sinai, but without Christianity and Islam, there is no external validation of any kind for that claim. The earliest records of the Sinai event come much later. There are no direct evidence of the 600,000 witnesses that claim that they actually experienced this event as described. What validates this claim historically is the connection to later Gentiles, particularly those who came to believe in the Jewish Bible through early Christian Jews and later through Islam as well. Christianity and later Islam lend credibility and validity to the Jewish claim of revelation at Sinai. So in a sense, it is actually Judaism that depends on Christianity, not the other way around. So if a man were to claim to be God, perform miracles, be killed, resurrected from the dead, and ascend to heaven, that alone would be enough to believe the stories are true, assuming, of course, the historical records can justify those claims. And we will get into that historical evidence now. So why should anyone believe in Christianity solely on the philosophical arguments? Well, we've established that Christianity meets the criteria for what a true religion would have to be in order to be considered valid. However, this philosophical alignment does not prove that Christianity is true. It just shows that Christianity is consistent with the criteria for truth that we've established. So now let's move to the historical case for Christianity. Atheists love to mock Christians, saying they believe in a sky daddy or a god with no evidence at all. But the reality is, it is the atheist who lacks evidence for their claims. They don't have any proof or evidence for the claim that God does not exist. Instead, they often fall into the logical fallacy of argument from ignorance, assuming that the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence. However, there is actually overwhelming amount of evidence supporting the truthfulness of Christianity. The life of Jesus is one of the most recorded events in history. We have detailed accounts of his crucifixion and resurrection, making it one of the most historically attested to events. For comparison, if we accept that Alexander the Great existed, despite the fact that the earliest writings about him were 300 to 400 years after his death, claiming to be based on accounts written about 100 years after he lived. But we have much more evidence for the life of Jesus, his miracles, and his resurrection, all written within a much closer time frame to his actual life. Not only that, but we have also outside attestation to these events from other historians, confirming the details of Jesus' life, crucifixion, claims to his resurrection, and perhaps most importantly, we have multiple disciples, people who were intimately familiar with Jesus, claiming that these events are true. These disciples were so committed to their testimony that they went willingly to their deaths rather than deny it. Now, there are those who challenge this claim, arguing that the only records we have of apostles dying for their faith come from church history. This claim, however, is simply not true. There are multiple early sources written by contemporaries or within the lifetime of these eyewitnesses that document the deaths of the apostles. In fact, these accounts are as historically valid as any other event that we accept as fact. And this all strengthens the case for Christianity, not only philosophically, but also historically. The consistency between the philosophical reasoning for Christianity and the historical evidence provides a powerful argument for its truth. And once we've established that the apostles genuinely went to their deaths rather than deny their belief, a common challenge then arises in response to that. Well, people die for their faith all the time. That doesn't necessarily make the belief true. However, this case is vastly different. These were not individuals who simply had faith in something they could not verify. These were eyewitnesses. The apostles weren't dying for something they believed in. They were dying for something they knew to be true. If the claims about Jesus had not been true, they would have been the ones that would have known that, and they would not have died for that lie. This isn't a case of people being willing to die for a belief on faith alone. It's a case of first-hand witnesses willing to die for their belief rather than deny what they had experienced. To claim that they were victims of mass psychosis, for example, would also require evidence of such a phenomenon, something we've never seen in history on such a scale. It's a unique claim with no precedent at all. Interestingly, Jewish polemicists who make this kind of argument might be uncomfortable with the implications. If they argue that the apostles could have been deluded in a mass psychosis, they must also consider the possibility that the claim of the revelation at Sinai, which is so central to Judaism, could also have been the result of mass psychosis. This presents a very awkward dilemma, especially for rabbis. Now, while we're on the topic of absurd and uncomfortable claims to make, a common anecdote I like to point out is this. Atheists often claim that if they were to witness something divine, then they would believe. They insist that the issue is simply a lack of evidence. But when you ask them, what if you saw a man claim to be God, get executed, and then rise from the dead a day later, walking around as if nothing happened? Well, when you ask them that, many would say that they still wouldn't believe. They'd find some other explanation, perhaps claiming that they simply don't understand what happened or there's some kind of trick going on. So even in the face of direct evidence, they would still deny it, rather than believe in God, simply because they have the presupposition that there are no gods. So therefore, there has to be another explanation, and this is a fallacy. We've all heard atheists say things like, if God is real, he should just write, I am here in the stars in Aramaic. But we all know that even then, many would dismiss it as some kind of illusion. Now, this was just a funny anecdote, but back to the main point here. What makes Christianity different from most other religions is the sheer volume of documented history backing up its central claims. We have extensive historical evidence that Jesus lived, claimed to be God, performed miracles, was crucified, and resurrected. The best that non-believing scholars can come up with is that they don't believe that these stories are true, but it is undeniable that the early Christians and the apostles genuinely believed in the resurrection. There's no intellectually honest way to explain away their conviction. For the non-believer who does not accept the resurrection, the only alternative is simply to dismiss the entire history, but even that requires an act of willful denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. Now, we get here into the final argument against Christianity, and this is the toughest one because it's to the other religion based on the Bible, which is Judaism. The final argument, often presented by Jewish apologists like Tuvia Singer, for example, is that Christianity cannot be true because it claims that Jesus fulfilled prophecies from the Old Testament. These apologists argue that early Christians, like Paul, distorted the Old Testament, took verses out of context, and manipulated the text to justify their belief in Jesus. For example, they claim that passages like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 are not about the Messiah, but about Israel or unrelated themes, and that Christians use mistranslations, such as the word pierced in Psalm 22, which they argue comes from the later translation in the Septuagint, rather than the original Hebrew. Now, there are some major problems with this argument from Jewish polemicists like Tuvia Singer, and I will explain those now. The first issue here is the claim that early Christians distorted the Old Testament to support their theological claims. This is highly problematic when examined from the perspective of rabbinical Judaism. Jewish texts like the Talmud, the Mishnah, and early Midrashim are full of instances where verses are taken out of context, reinterpreted to support theological or legalistic claims. In fact, the use of midrashic interpretation is inherently based on extrapolating meaning from verses, often with little direct connection to the literal plain meaning of the text. This approach, which is foundational to rabbinical literature, vastly outnumbers any similar actions by Paul or early Christians, likely in a ratio of over 1,000 to 1, meaning there are more than 1,000 to 1 instances of rabbis doing this to Paul or early Christians. The early rabbinic tradition, the entire rabbinic tradition lies entirely on the reinterpretation of the text, sometimes creating new meanings that are far removed from the original intent of the verses. If we were to apply the standard that Jewish polemicists like Singer set for Christianity to the Talmud and other rabbinic literature, this would actually condemn much of Judaism, including mainstream branches that accept Kabbalah, for example. These traditions often rely on interpreting and expanding on verses, much as Christians do with certain Old Testament prophecies. In fact, if one accepts the argument that taking verses out of context invalidates the interpretation, then most of Judaism, especially Kabbalah, would be discredited as heretical from a biblical perspective. Now, another major issue put forward with the claims put forward by polemicists like Tuvia Singer is that they are simply not accurate. For instance, the claim that Isaiah 53 refers to the nation of Israel rather than the Messiah. This is a much later medieval interpretation, and it is a fringe view that has only gained prominence in certain anti-missionary circles. Now, for example, Rabbi Emanuel Shochet, who is also an anti-missionary rabbi, or was rather, but much more intellectually honest, actually condemned this interpretation, arguing that the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 has traditionally been understood as the messianic figure in Jewish theology. Shochet and other scholars highlight that this view is not supported by the majority of Jewish scholars, either past or present, and that this reinterpretation of Isaiah 53 by people like Tuvia Singer serves as a polemical tool against Christianity and does not reflect the true Jewish understanding of the text. By adhering to this fringe stance, figures like Tuvia Singer are actually engaging in deceptive polemics, misrepresenting Jewish beliefs about the Messiah. This is not accepted by the majority of Jewish scholars, making Singer's position untenable within the broader context of Jewish thought. Now, here's another really, either it's being done intentionally or it's just really stupid. A common argument made by Rabbi Tuvia Singer is that Christians should not rely on midrashic literature to prove that Jesus is God. According to Singer, midrashim and the Talmud, for example, represent rabbinic authority, which Christians do not recognize. So why would a Christian turn to rabbinical literature for any claims about Jesus? This view overlooks the actual intent behind referencing these sources. Christians are not using midrash to elevate its rabbinical authority. Rather, they are pointing out that earlier Jewish thinkers and interpretations, long before the finalization of what we know as rabbinical Judaism today, often contained ideas that align closely with Christian theology, particularly regarding the Messiah and God. And to call these rabbinic is even a misnomer, because a lot of these predate anything we know about the existence of rabbis or anything of that nature. When Christians reference midrashic literature or early Jewish sources, they are not claiming that these texts hold the same divine authoritative weight as the Bible. Instead, they are simply examining how early Jewish thought expressed in sources like the Tanaim, earlier midrashim, and pre-rabbinic writings contain concepts that align with the Christian understanding of the Messiah, which was later altered or obscured by rabbinic tradition. The Christian argument is that these early sources contain glimpses of beliefs about the Messiah's divine role and suffering that were later minimized, reinterpreted, or hidden as rabbinic Judaism evolved to resist Christian claims. Christian apologists often highlight how certain passages from early Jewish writing seem to resonate with the New Testament teachings. These early Jewish interpretations, before the rise of rabbinic tradition and the closure of the Jewish canon, so to speak, reflect a Jewish understanding of a suffering and divine Messiah. The evidence points to an earlier Jewish context in which the Messiah was not just a political leader, but had divine attributes, a concept that was later suppressed as rabbinic Judaism established its framework. The use of early Jewish sources is not an attempt by Christianity to legitimize authority of rabbinic interpretations, but to trace continuity between early Jewish theology and Christian beliefs. The distinction is crucial. Christians are pointing to a broader spectrum of Jewish thought and showing that ideas closely related to Jesus' divine identity existed within rabbinic Judaism long before rabbinic Judaism took the shape that we know of it today. These are ideas that were later modified in response to the spread of Christianity and its claims as polemic attacks. The key argument here is that the early midrashic interpretations, alongside other ancient sources, reveal a more nuanced picture of Jewish expectations of the Messiah. While these sources are not accepted as divinely inspired by Christians, they serve as important historical documents that reflect Jewish views prior to the establishment of rabbinic dogma. Therefore, when Christians point to these texts, they aren't making the claim to their authority, but rather showing that early Jewish thought contains seeds of what would later become central Christian theology. Rabbi Singer's objections to this is based on a misunderstanding of the role these early sources play in Christian thought. It's not about validating rabbinic authority, but about showing how the Jewish world was more open to the concept of a divine and suffering Messiah than later rabbinic literature would suggest. This approach challenges the narrative that rabbinic Judaism is the only legitimate form of Jewish thought and highlights the diversity of Jewish belief in early Jewish thought, many of which are quite similar to Christian views of Jesus as the Messiah. By pointing out these parallels, Christians are not distorting Jewish tradition, but rather reclaiming the original spirit of the Jewish messianic hope that was over time reinterpreted by rabbinic authorities in the post-temple period as a response to Christianity. Now, another claim often raised by Jewish apologists like Singer is that Christians manipulated the Old Testament by relying on later translations, such as the Greek Septuagint, to justify their claims. For example, the famous argument about the word alma, young woman, versus betula, virgin, in the book of Isaiah, which Singer claims was misinterpreted by Christians to fit the narrative of the virgin birth of Jesus, is an attempt to discredit Christian theology. However, Singer's claim that the Septuagint was a later distortion created by the church is simply false. There are earlier Greek translations of Hebrew scriptures, all referred to as Septuagint, that predate the life of Jesus and align closely with the claims of the New Testament. These early Greek versions, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient Hebrew manuscripts, validate the Christian interpretation of the Old Testament. These texts existed long before Christianity emerged and show no sign of manipulation to fit Christian theology. These were translations done by Jewish scholars prior to the life of Jesus. Moreover, Singer's insistence that the Masoretic text, the basis for modern Jewish Bibles, is the original unaltered version of the Hebrew Bible. This ignores the fact that earlier Hebrew manuscripts, such as those found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, differ in spelling and some aspects of translation. The Masoretic text was compiled much later, around the 9th century, and reflects later traditions and conventions. In fact, some of the early Hebrew manuscripts use different alphabets and linguistic features, which undermines the claim that the text has been perfectly preserved since its inception. This is a significant flaw in the rabbinic argument, as it contradicts the claim that the Masoretic text is the unchanged, divinely protected version of the Bible with every dot, every nikuda exactly as it is supposed to be. Christianity, in contrast, does not claim that every letter and vowel of the Bible is perfectly preserved. While Christians believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, they also recognize the possibility of human error in transcription, as with any ancient text. Despite this, the meaning of the scriptures remains intact across the generations, as evidenced by the consistency between the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text. This demonstrates that even with scribal errors and variations, the essential meaning of the scriptures has been faithfully preserved, and this in and of itself is quite miraculous, though it's not word for word identical, obviously. Now, ultimately, the claims made by Jewish apologists like Singer that Christians distorted the Old Testament to fit their theological framework simply misses the point. Even if there were variations or reinterpretations of certain verses, the central claim of Christianity, that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, is rooted in the historical reality of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The apostles, being filled with the Holy Spirit, used the scriptures to point to Jesus as the Messiah, and their writings formed the basis of Christian belief. And even if some branches of Christianity have distorted or misinterpreted certain aspects of Scripture, this does not invalidate Christianity as a whole. Singer's criticisms in the end does not hold weight against the Christian historical claims. Christianity is grounded in the life, teachings of a man who claimed to be God, proved it through his resurrection, and left behind a legacy that has persisted for 2 millennia. While there may be flaws in certain denominations or interpretations within Christianity, the historical evidence for the life of Jesus, his death and resurrection, provides a solid foundation for the Christian faith. Therefore, as someone who believes in God, the natural progression for me would be not to accept the distorted political rabbinical Judaism, but rather embrace Christianity, which does in fact fulfill the will of God as revealed in the Old Testament, and does not distort the scriptures as rabbinical Judaism does. Now, I want to be very clear that the purpose of this video is not to evangelize or push any particular agenda. That has never been my way, and it is unlikely ever to be my way of doing things. I'm not here to convince anyone or to adopt my beliefs. Instead, this is simply an expression of my views after being asked and pressed about them on numerous occasions. It felt like the right time to finally put forth some kind of idea about my thoughts on what I believe and why I hold to those beliefs. And ultimately, it's about presenting my perspective based on years of reflection and study. Now, I respect everyone's right to explore and come to their own conclusions, and I encourage people to do just that. Take what resonates with you, leave the rest, and always be willing to question and dig deeper. And I do want to thank you for taking the time to watch, and I hope this was insightful for you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe this video if you found any kind of meaning or usefulness out of it.